Well, thank you, Nick. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. It really is a pleasure to be back at the U of A. I miss it almost daily, and I hadn't realised quite how much until I came here. So through my talk, what I'm hoping to give you is a very, very brief overview of kind of the sport parenting literature and particularly my contribution to it. But as Nick very acutely made you aware, I spend a lot of my time now working with organizations, and so this has probably been the more challenging presentation for me to write whilst I'm here, because I don't tend to speak to academic audiences all that much anymore. I spend a lot of my time presenting to parents and presenting to coaches, so this won't be how I used to remember speaker series presentations. It's a little bit more applied and a little bit more general. There's no fancy graphs, but hopefully I can take you sort of on my journey through sport parenting, and also kind of on my journey through from being a graduate student here to a faculty member. So in terms of the title, that's really clickbait. I use that title a lot with parents. They all think that their parents are that their children are a sporting superstar, and so it's a great way of kind of getting them involved. But what I really want to do through this presentation is start with kind of where my take on the sport parenting literature started. So that's kind of the perceptions that I came in with and where I think the research was. Where I think it currently is, and for me I think there's a lot of problems around that, and problems in terms of we're identifying those problems, and then some of where my work is going and what I'm hoping to sort of see in the future, and then a few of my reflections. So when I first got into sport parenting, it was actually during my undergrad when I was at Loughborough University, and at that point, obviously this is newer headlines than that. But at that point, parents were starting to get a really bad rap. We were starting to see that there were issues with parents, this perception of parents getting it right or getting it wrong. And over the years, we've seen more and more of these headlines coming out. And particularly in the UK, I like to say that the media hates parents, and I think that they do, until it becomes the Olympics, when parents are heralded, because now we've got these people who made us, number 2 in the world or number 3 in the world for gold medals. So when I started getting interested in sport parenting, it really was against a backdrop, and it continues to be against a backdrop of negative representations of parents. And the research was only just sort of starting to develop. So Nick actually got into the scene of the sport parenting research before I did, and he did some of the seminal work building off some other ideas that had been developed, really looking at the roles of parents and looking at how parents impact within the lives of young athletes. So one of the texts that's referenced consistently is some work by Frederick and Eccles, which recognises the impact of parents as role models within children's sporting experiences, the providers of children's sporting experiences, and then also the interpreters. And for me, the interpreters part has always been the most interesting, because the interpreters part around sport parenting is really around how parents engage with their children and help them make sense of the experience that they're having. Alongside Frederick's and Eccles' chapter that we really need to move on from citing continually. There has been work since 2004. One of the first papers that Nick was involved in was looking at what roles parents took on in the lives of talented athletes. And specifically, they identified parents in terms of their provision of logistical support or tangible support, emotional support, and also informational support. So when the literature was really first developing, it was really focused on what's the role of parents? Okay, so we know parents are going to play some sort of role, but specifically, what are those roles? And over time, we've started to see people recognise that those roles might change, and that what we need from parents at different times will differ. So Jean Cotet's very first paper, which I was just speaking to him last week, and he said it's not even a very good paper, but it's a very important paper for our area, because it started to identify how parents would, how their impact might change and what we need from them at different stages. I've added to that initial work by pulling on some of the psychological considerations, for instance, recognising that as children move into the specialising stage, so as they enter sort of early adolescence, perceptions of competence tend to drop. Okay, so as you start to move into a period where you're compared to everyone, we know your perceptions of physical competence drop, so parents play a really important role of supporting that. We know also as you move into competition settings that, as you move into adolescence, competitions increase, and so the impact and the role of parents is going to be even more important there. One of the things that I do see in my research, and one of the things I really want to start to see change in the literature, is this idea that parents only are important during adolescence and childhood. And what we know is that as you move into the investment stage, so as you move 16 and older, parents really do continue to be important, and all of the things that parents have said at an earlier stage will have been internalized, and they'll continue to have an impact. But also, I don't know so much in Canada, but in the UK, we sort of talk about adolescence now going till you're about the age of 25. So because no one's independent and no one's got any money, you know, parents continue to be really important. And we see that much more within the sort of athletic domain. So we know this, we know that parents are important, we know that there's sort of their involvement across a lifespan is going to change. And we also know that how parents are involved will impact on the outcomes that children experience. So when parents get it right, we have a substantial body of evidence that it has hugely positive outcomes for children. When they get it wrong, there's hugely negative outcomes, unsurprisingly. But it's a very artificial distinction. And when I first started getting into the parenting literature, it was sort of a standard accepted distinction that there were good things and these were supportive things, and there are bad things and these are pressuring things. And we tend to talk about that still now. So I have a graduate student who's just doing a systematic review around the outcomes associated with parental involvement. And it is messy. It's taken him over a year just to try and write this thing up because the literature's really messy, but we continually try to separate it. And I think one of the things that I really learned working with Nick and being here at the U of A was the importance of looking beyond what the literature says and really being critical of it. And rather than just accepting that there's good and there's bad, my whole career has been trying to get away from that. But that's not to say I haven't contributed to that literature, which I did. So Casey's in the room, so shout out to Casey for one of these studies. But when we first started looking at parents here, we added to the literature base. We wanted to know whether there were certain things parents should be doing. We wanted to get beyond this idea of just support. We wanted to move beyond the idea that simply being supportive is enough. And we wanted to understand what that support might look like. So we asked athletes, we did some interviews with tennis players, we did some interviews with a range of female athletes, and really what we started to find out was it's much messier than simply giving emotional support or being available. It's very much dependent on the individual child. It's very much dependent on what the parent is bringing to the situation. And of course, parenting is not limited simply to that period of time between the first whistle and the last whistle, or between when the gun goes and the race ends. So whilst I'm relatively critical of this research often when I talk about it, because I do think we added to this idea that there's good and there's bad, what we did start to do was uncover some of those intricacies around parental involvement. And I've added to that even further recently, coming into a study with some colleagues looking specifically at parental involvement in the home environments, in the training environments, and in the competition environments. And what we learned through this paper is really there's no point just considering competitions. Really the competition is a very minor part of when a parent is going to impact on a child, and actually it's those conversations that are happening at home, it's the conversations that are happening around training that are really, really vital to kind of consider and understand. And then finally around this same idea, the main study of my PhD was really about trying to say, okay, so we've got an idea of what parents might do. We've got an understanding of some good things and some bad things, and I use those terms very flippantly because I don't actually agree with good and bad parenting. And we came up with this theory. And so the theory really was trying to say, rather than saying you have to do this or you shouldn't do this, it was saying how can we help all parents optimize their involvement? And what we found was that if you get parents starting from the same base, So if parents and kids want the same thing, and that same thing might change very, very often, and then parents engage in a way that really demonstrates an understanding of what the child wants and how the child feels within the sports, and then engages in these specific ways within competitions, they're more likely to have a positive impact. In doing this study, though, it sort of tied into some previous research I'd done and some research going forward, which moves me into the next step of really going, well, what's the problem with the sport parenting literature? When I was back at Loughborough, so before I started my PhD here, I had done some research looking at parenting stress. And I'd been really interested in this because my mum found it incredibly stressful having a child involved in sport. And when I did these studies, I felt the need to phone up and apologise to her at the end, because it can be really challenging for parents. And at the same time, there was some work coming out of the U of A here, which was showing that how parents were involved would really depend on a number of different things. So we knew that how parents empathise with their kids is likely to impact on their involvement. And then also there's some work coming out of Australia looking at the sporting culture and how culture might impact on how parents can be involved and what their engagement is with their children. So whilst we've got these nice theories and we've got these nice ideas around what what children want, we actually have a much more complicated environment to try and deal with. And this is really where some of my future research my newer research moved on to, both in my PhD and since then. So specifically, I had some real frustration about the idea that parents are just getting it wrong on the sidelines. I know in Edmonton recently, maybe in the last year, they banned some parents. There was a big issue with hockey in Edmonton. And it's really easy to just blame parents, and it's really easy to say you should know what you're doing, stand on the sidelines, be quiet, don't shout, don't scream, do the right things. But when you talk to parents, it's actually much harder than that. And so one of the studies I did in my PhD was trying to understand what it's like at a competition. And I had to go and do this in Australia, because that's also something that's really important to try and build into PhD, travel a long way away to collect some of the data. I didn't need to do it in Australia, but I wanted to. And so I spent a period of 6 weeks over in Australia talking to parents at competitions. For those of you who are grad students in the room, if you are hanging out at a competition or you're hanging out in the environment where you want to collect data, that's always going to be helpful. I didn't have one parent say no to me, because in 6 weeks I was just hanging out there and they got to know me and I was helping with setup. And so all of those interviews, every person I asked took part. And what we found was competitions are really dull. Parents find them really boring. They spent at that time a lot of time playing Angry Birds. They didn't know what was going on. They were hanging out in really warm conditions. They actually had to stop the games a number of times because it was too hot. And the parents really said, we don't enjoy it. We don't enjoy being here, and we really don't enjoy watching our children lose. And when you think about it as a parent, there's not many environments that you sit in where you watch your children fail. Sport is unique, except for the odd music concert maybe, that you actually sit there and you watch your child fail, and no one can prepare someone for that. At least this is what the parents were saying. So when we did this research, it became increasingly clear to me that really what we needed to do was understand how to address some of these contextual issues if we want to try and work with parents in a better way. And since then I've had a number of other studies, and I won't go into all of these, but really trying to uncover, okay, so we understand the competition environment a little bit. We talk about it being emotionally charged, we talk about it being really stressful and really challenging. But life for a parent is much more than just the competition, and those challenges and those stresses, they continue way beyond this. And so when you start thinking about the whole experience of being a parent, you can start to be really critical of the literature that we currently have that just says, do this or don't do this. Or if you can say these things, your kid's going to be happy, and if you say these things, they're not. And so that's really, if you ever look at my body of research, it looks a bit messy, but the whole intent is trying to get to some of this complexity. What's going on for parents? And just as I was finishing up my PhD, I was really fortunate to connect back with my undergraduate supervisor at Loughborough. And what we started to do was look at how the literature base all comes together. And why was this one important? Well, this was important because it's the first time beyond my lit review for my PhD that I'd actually had a chance to sit down and say, okay, if we did try and pull this literature together, what should parents be doing, or what would be helpful for parents? And we came up with this idea of parenting expertise, not saying there's expert parents, but saying that there's a set of skills that might help you as a parent be more appropriately involved in your child's sporting experience. As you can see, and I won't go through them all, they cover everything. Okay, so this was us summarizing the literature to try and give some really clear guidance, and what we found was that you have to first select the right opportunities, then you have to provide the right types of support, then you need to consider your parenting style, you need to manage the emotional demands of competition, you need to manage the demands of sport, you need to recognize when transitions are happening. And all in all, what we found was that the evidence is all over the place and the literature is a mess. And the reason that the literature, in my opinion, is a mess is that being a sport parent or parenting a kid involved in sport is messy and it's complicated and it's all sorts of things that as researchers we don't tend to like. We like nice relationships, we like the idea that if we change this it impacts on this. And I've been really fortunate because I talk about this a lot. I've been really fortunate to have an opportunity to write a few review papers, and this one which was recently in Current Opinions in Psychology, I decided I was just going to write it. I was just going to write about how complex it was, and I was just going to put it out there and see what people thought. And what that's allowed me to do is really push the idea that if we really want to work with parents, if we really want to improve children's experiences in sport, which are fundamentally impacted by parents' involvement, we need to start considering parenting with all the messiness and all of the complexity. So when I talk to parents and when I talk to coaches, I often draw, just to flip it around, I put parents in the center. We always put athletes in the center, and I know why we do that. We do that because we're trying to be athlete-centered and we're trying to encourage this idea that, you know, we'll take care of all of the needs of athletes. But when you flip it and you put a parent in the center, you start to realize that actually we aren't even halfway there with the literature, because we haven't even started to consider sport parenting within general parenting. We haven't started to consider it really within all of the other demands that parents are experiencing. We're still considering it really only within a sporting context. And I did a webinar recently where I just decided that I'd had enough of this idea. I'd had enough of the idea that when you're a sport parent, that's somehow different to being a parent. And actually I have a European project that I'm working on, and we have a long conversation around whether when you're a sport parent or you're parenting a child in sport, are you trying to parent through sport or are you parenting in sport? And actually, if you start to consider that parents might be parenting through sport, how you consider parents becomes very different. So then you can start to understand why a parent might lose it on the sidelines because their child is not behaving the way they want them to. And for them as a parent, that can be a little bit threatening now, and this is going against their values and their aims. So we have a long, long way to go if we start to really think about, okay, well, what's going on for parents and how can we really go about working to address this? So some of the work that I've recently done all ties into trying to uncover some of this complexity. And I just mentioned to Nick earlier, I don't have a lot of time to write anymore, and so my steps in making these changes in the literature are very small from a research perspective, but much bigger from an applied perspective, because I have a lot of conversations with parents and I have a lot of conversations with coaches, and so I'm probably doing it all the wrong way, especially when you come from a very prestigious research institution like the U of A, and I'm just starting to make the change and then hoping that literature will catch up. But just to give you a few examples of how we know that this is a factor and really is impacting on the work we do, I just for fun did a study just recently, and it really was just for fun. to try and work out what parents think about sports psychology, and particularly what they think about their role within it and their role in sort of addressing sort of their children's psychological development and what they should be doing. So we did 100 parents completed surveys, then we followed up with interviews, and it's really fascinating because parents are scared of sports psychology because it's something that should be developed, should be taught by an expert, and it's not something that they want to be involved in. And they really don't understand that everything they're saying and all of the behaviours they're engaging in will impact on their child and their child's psychological development. And so one of the questions asked, actually a number of the questions, asked the parents to explain what they wanted to do when their child was competing and leading up to a competition. And the parents had really clear ideas of all the things they wanted to say and how they wanted to behave. But they just didn't do it. And so we asked them, do you manage to do this, and what stops you? And everything stops them. Time, understanding, opportunities, frustration at work. All these complexities of life are really preventing parents doing what they want to do. And so I have a number of PhD students currently who are trying to understand, okay, if we say this is the ideal, if this is what parents should be doing, let's present that to parents and ask them what's going to stop them doing it. Okay, because we have to start understanding that every time we put something out there and suggest these are things you should do and someone can't do it, it becomes even harder for them. Okay, so we're now getting to the position where we're saying to parents, do this. They absolutely can't do it for valid reasons, and now they're feeling like they're failing. Okay, so we have to start understanding, okay, what are we suggesting and how is that coming through? I also have another study, again, just done for a bit of fun, looking at mothers and fathers. So rugby is the national sport in Wales. It's very still dominated by masculinity, and so we did a study with university rugby players, and we asked them to consider how their parents had been involved over the lifetime. If there's anyone in the room who's not into gender norms, you would hate reading these transcripts. They are as gendered as they come. Mothers stay in the back. They do all the hidden jobs. We don't really like them to be around. We kind of laugh at them when they try and support us and be involved. Fathers can coach, they can be on the sidelines. We still want to make our fathers proud when they come and watch us, even though we're university students. And so we start to see right away that there's a culture thing. Okay, so there's a culture of sport, there's the culture around gender and how genders are involved that are impacting on what parents can do. So again, we come out with parents should do this or should do that, but we never split it by gender. We never split it by sport. We never consider how these kind of cultural factors might be impacting. You also then have to consider the fact that kids are different. Okay, so how you parent your child, I know there's a lot of parents in the room, how you parent your child will be in direct response to how your child is. You're not going to parent your child the same way as someone else parents their child, partially because of your values and what's going on for you as a parent, but also because of what your child brings to the table. So one of the things is whether they've been identified as talented. We've just had a study accepted looking exactly at this. What is it like to be a talented athlete, and how do parents need to change their involvement based off that label? You know, these athletes talked about the fact that as soon as they're labelled talented and they're put into these elite programs, they start to lose their friends, or their friends want to be involved with them for different reasons. They have these incredible schedules that they have to stick to, and you know, as a result of that, what they want from their parents is going to change. And then we also have a study, sorry, something's gone wrong with the formatting. We also have a study that's just going out where I've got drawn into the world of perfectionism, so I'm glad that John's not in the room, where we're looking at understanding children's experiences of being a different type of perfectionist. So within the different subtypes of perfectionism, what is it like for them? And what they talk about is the fact that they need entirely different engagement with their coaches, that sport has different meanings to them, that they take feedback and criticism in very different ways. And so where we're now going with that study is saying, okay, well, what does that mean for parenting? So we need to get away from this idea that all kids are the same, and we need to start going, okay, well, if kids are different, which we know they are, and they're coming with different personality considerations, then we need to start thinking about how we're adapting that. And then finally, I've talked about the complexity of children, I've talked about the complexity of parents. We also have an incredibly complex youth sport environment. And it's one that I am increasingly going off, if I'm honest, and one that I think is incredibly concerning. So in the UK, I don't know if you'd be familiar, but I know it's also happened in the States, we've had lots of stories coming out around abusive practice in sport, and we have a number of our sports in crisis, not signing contracts, going through disciplinaries, to the point where our government commissioned a duty of care report, and all organisations have now had to respond to this, and they have to demonstrate how they're not only developing performers, but they're looking after athletes. The thing that's really concerning when you start to get into this literature is a lot of the elite youth sport environments are abusive. And the behaviours that you're seeing are abusive, and coaching behaviours are abusive. And I just was in Cochrane last weekend, and a parent there mentioned how her 5 or 6-year-old son was going to gymnastics, and the coaches were pushing them down to develop flexibility, and the kids are crying, and that parents are accepting this. That falls into abusive practice. And we've just had a study, this was over in Australia, where we talked to parents and we gave them stories of abuse from kids. So these were stories that had come out of previous research. And when we showed them to parents, they accepted those as okay coaching practices. And they accepted it because they're normalized. Well, the coach knows best. They've had elite performers. These things are okay. And then when you explain to them that actually these practices are abuse and that actually these practices aren't okay, they start to recognize that. But they still, in some instances, went, yeah, but the coach knows. Okay, so we have not only to consider what's going on for children and what's going on for parents, but we have to consider what environment are we creating and what are we putting people in. And so my big issue with a lot of the practice from coaches is that they're concerned by parents. Parents stress them out. They don't know what to do, so they push them aside. It's easier not to deal with them as a problem. But we know that this abusive kind of coaching practice exists, and now you're taking the one sort of lifeline away from a child. So, for me, we really need to start considering some of these aspects. And that's really led me to what I spend a lot of my time doing, which is Parent in Sport Week. So whilst I've been at Swansea, I've had a real opportunity to work with a number of people. A lot of that comes from the fact that Wales is small, and there's not a huge number of researchers in Wales. There's a number of universities, but not near where Sport Wales, who oversees it, oversees all sport, is based. And I've started to work with a child protection in sport unit, hence my interest in some of this sort of area. But when I was working with them, my role is really to help them understand parenting behaviours. And that role came about because they were having sports organisations coming to them and saying, what's going on? Like, parents are doing our heads in, they're causing all sorts of issues. And the response was very negative. The response from organisations was, well, we'll keep them away, we'll ban them, we'll red card them, we'll do silent games, all of these sort of very behavioural, individual, blame the parent kind of approaches. And what the Child Protection and Sport Unit decided to do was develop Parents in Sport Week as a way of kind of changing the conversation about parents. Let's talk about them in a positive way, and also use this week as a chance to tell parents some suggestions that might help them, give them some ideas of things that they could do and how that might be useful moving forward. So we're now into our second year of Parent in Sport Week, which one of my colleagues very kindly calls Camilla Week, which cracks me up, but it's also the first week of our teaching semester, so it's a bit of a busy time for me. But really excitingly this year, Parent in Sport Week moved over to Canada, so we're now an international initiative, so that was a lot led by Nick and his team and the Active for Life group. And really what we're starting to see is the conversations are changing. And instead of it being instantly blaming parents, it's going, all right, well, as a club, have we done what we can to help parents? As a coach, have we done what we can to help parents? You know, even little things, and I know it's easier said than done, but even little things that we've seen from coaches moving training from 4:30 till 5. So now as a parent, you can actually finish a working day and then get your child to training. That has a huge impact. Okay, so when we start to consider the complexity and when we start to consider all of the issues and all of the challenges that parents might be facing, and we start to address it at an organizational, cultural level, I personally, not that we have the data to back it up yet, but I personally think that we're going to see much more change, and it makes me much more hopeful for where this research might go. And that's where we currently are. And now I'm going to transition into this, and I'm going to make it a fluid transition. And the reason that I think I found it really hard to reflect on being a grad student here and the next step forward. And then I went to my presentation, and I did my presentation exactly how I would do a presentation. And I realized that some of the challenge for me was that the U of A is such a phenomenally well-known research-driven institution and filled with such excellent researchers that I've always felt a little bit like a fraud on the sidelines because I do very applied research. And for me, it's all about making an impact, and it's all about those day-to-day conversations. And since I've been here in Edmonton, I've had 2 conversations that have made me realize that my research is worthwhile. I had one coach who came up to me at the Science and Triathlon Conference who thanked me for for my presentation and said, I'm a really bad coach for parents. And I've moved out of coaching children because I can't deal with the parents. I had to have a conversation with my high performance director tonight about some parents. I went to be negative and I reframed it, and we had a much more positive conversation. And that for me validates all of the research I do beyond sort of impact and peer review and all of those sorts of things. And so whilst that might sound like I'm criticizing U of A, which I'm not at all, what I'm recognizing is that whilst the U of A is a phenomenally good research institution, what it allowed me to do was to grow as a thinker. And I lost that a little bit when I moved back to a new country. Going back to the UK was like going back to a new country because I understood the system here. I knew how people worked. I understood grants. I understood all of these things. And then I went to another environment. Swansea University is not like the U of A. We are not in the top 10 of anything on an international stage. We are a small institution. There are 20 staff members in sports science. When I started, there were 12. 6 of those just got hired this year, okay? So it's a slow grower. It's a very basic science course. So when I started, there was one other sports psychologist, and everyone else was physiologists and biomechanists. And I sat there as a qualitative researcher going, what have I done? Oh, and to add to that, we're in the College of Engineering. So everyone around me is an engineer. And I sat there going, what am I doing here? How am I going to cope? And that really forced me to come back to my roots in terms of what had I learned here at the U of A that was going to allow me to move forward. And what I had learned here was to think. And I learned to take time to think. And I didn't realize it at the time. I didn't realize that the U of A is just this phenomenal place to think. And there's people to think with. And there's people to discuss ideas with. And there's people to bounce ideas off. And there's people to allow you to think, I say broadly, critically, and differently. Because for me, I always thought broader than maybe I should have, and it led to confusing talks at times. I remember Nick telling me once, your talks don't make sense. And I think it was because I was thinking broadly. But I also was allowed to be very critical here, and I think being critical was really fundamentally important. But recently, what I've learned is as an academic, I need to think differently. So I need to think differently to other people because the literature annoys me. So if the literature annoys me and I want to change it, I have to think differently to how other people are thinking. The other thing that really came to mind for me is that the U of A has phenomenal resources. Like for a start, you have every journal, which we don't have at Swansea, increasingly so. But you have amazing scholars and you have amazing academics within reach, and you have really, really great networks across institutions. And I kind of wish I'd taken more opportunity to use that, to recognize how you can work with different people and draw on different ideas. But for me, that's one of the things that when you move to another institution and you're quite isolated, that you miss. That you start to realize, actually, this is not fun on your own. It's not fun. Even if you have a network and that network is always away from you, it's not easy to do it on your own. And so that one for me is a real take home in terms of, you can do it on your own, don't get me wrong, you can do it at small universities. I'm doing it at a small university and it's working okay. But when you've got the opportunity to use those resources around you, I'd really encourage that. The other thing that I've learned is I will take PhD busy over academic faculty member busy any day. I used to think I was busy and I made myself busy, and I think that Nick's proudest moment was probably the first time I started to say no to some things. He used to tell me, you may not remember this, he used to tell me he was teaching me to say no. I still am not great at saying no, but at least when you're a PhD student, you've got someone above you who kind of cares a little bit about your schedule and tries to keep you on track. Now no one does that, and it's entirely down to me, and I mess it up frequently. I overschedule and I don't have the time to commit to the things that I want to commit to, and I really wish, I had taken the time as a PhD student to better figure out, okay, what is actual capacity? And don't keep pushing over capacity. Figure out what's capacity where you do your best work, because I really needed to know that now as a faculty member. But beyond all of those things, the absolutely most important thing that I learned about from being a PhD student at the U of A was to identify my values as an academic. As an academic, I want to make a difference with my research. I do not care about awards and accolades. I want to make a difference with my research. I want to have conversations with the people who will take my work and run with it. It's probably the skill that I have developed the most whilst being an academic, and that's because my value is, what I value as an academic is making that difference. But that gets threatened constantly. I grew up at the U of A with phenomenal researchers who I see present at conferences who are doing much more complicated, much more impressive research than I'm doing, good science, and not applied science. And I sit there and I go, maybe I should go that way again. Or then someone at the university is talking about some awards they've been put up for, and I think, maybe I should be looking at that. But when I come back to what I value as an academic, it really helps me to ground myself again and realize why I'm doing what I'm doing. And one of the things that I really do value, and one of the things that I've always held very highly within my work, and that definitely comes from working in Nick's lab where grad students were number one, is working with students. So one of my issues with my schedule is I have too many students. But one of my values is supporting the progress of others, so I'm always going to have a lot of students. So I'm really fortunate right now to have 4 master's students and 5 PhD students who are all doing great work. 2 of them are led by someone else, so it's not quite as busy as it seems. But all of the work, all of the thinking that I do really comes from them and comes from this value that I have around supporting the progress of others. And coming through the U of A is the only reason that I would know that that's important to me. So I'll always be grateful for Nick and everyone here at the U of A for allowing me to learn who I was, to think broadly and critically and figure out what I wanted to do with my career. And that's it. So thank you for listening, and most importantly, thank you for having me back.